We'll get started now. So hello, everyone, and welcome to our session, High Stakes, a Vision for Cannabis 2.0. Jason and Insu, welcome to our session today. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for listening in. We appreciate your time during these crazy COVID lockdowns. We appreciate the ability to convey our thoughts and our experience with you. I hear some background noise in here. Can we turn off the background noise or mute other than just myself and Jason for now? Maggie? There we go. All right, so we'd like to get started. Jason and I have been consultants and or investors in the cannabis field for the last 10 years. My background comes from Wall Street in finance, and as you can tell, Jason comes from the legal side of it. We've looked at various operations. We've worked in various operations in the cannabis space over the past 9-10 years. And also we've had our own careers in finance and legal aspects. Let me see if we can move to the next slide here. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can get this. The agenda for the webinar today is to discuss very few things that we think are going to have a direct impact into the cannabis industry, specifically in the US, which will definitely affect all the companies in Canada. We're calling this the next phase of the cannabis industry's Cannabis 2.0, and we'll get to the explanation of that very shortly. But we want to discuss decriminalization versus legalization. They're two different things. We'd like to give you a brief history of cannabis. It goes back 5,000 years, but we really want to discuss the last 50 years. And then some of the public policy implications in the United States that is about to occur or has already occurred in the United States. And specifically, we want to address a tax code in the United States called IRS Tax Code 280E and why that affects cannabis in the United States and how that affects cannabis in Canada. So we're here to talk about weed. You know, you call it marijuana, you call it ganja, you call it cannabis or whatever else. It's federally illegal in the United States. The US has a very funny structure. We have federal laws and we have state laws. In 1937, the Marijuana Act was passed, which illegalized marijuana. And before that, marijuana was totally legal. You could transmit it, you could grow it, you could have commerce with it. In fact, majority of the homes had usually one or two plants in their backyard, and people used it for medicinal purposes, like most people have done for the past 5,000 years. And in 1970, during the Nixon era, Richard Nixon, who was president at the time, got tired of all of the flower childs and the hippies protesting the war in Vietnam. So he had his administration place cannabis on the Schedule 1 list. And that made it incredibly illegal. But in the past 20 years, 25 years, 36 states in the United States have legalized weed. That's the state. That's not federal. So what does that mean? Well, as of 2 weeks ago, South Dakota and Mississippi became legal. Texas became legal 2 years ago. And also, I believe New Jersey also became recreationally legal, if I'm correct. Jason, am I correct on that? Or are they still only?
Yeah, that's correct. New Jersey and Arizona both legalized recreational sales, retail sales.
Great. So essentially 70%, a little over 70% of all the states in the United States have legalized marijuana in one way, shape, or form, whether it's medicinal or medicinal and recreational. The red states that you see up there are fully legal, meaning recreational and medicinal. The blue states and the circled states are the states that are medicinally legal, and the gray states are the states that have yet to enact any legislation to make it legal. So in the last 2 weeks, Arizona, New Jersey, Montana, and South Dakota just legalized recreational states, taking the total to 16 states. 2 additional states added to the medical states, and that was Mississippi and South Dakota. The illegal states are listed here. And why is this important? Well, 36 takes us over 70% of all the states that have legalized marijuana. And we'll get to that in a few slides later. But this is essentially the timeline of how all the states have legalized over the past 10 years. But it really started in 1996 with California. But then we've slowly increased the number of states that have totally legalized marijuana for medical use or recreational and medical use. If anybody has any questions, please send us text while we're going through this so we can address your questions a little later on. So what is Cannabis 2.0? Well, Cannabis 1.0 is cannabis in the United States with consequences to the IRS Tax Code 280E. And 2.0 is cannabis without the IRS Tax Code 280E. So let us explain what that means in the next slide. But the tax code 280E effectively makes the cannabis industry in the United States unprofitable, or very, very little profits flow through because of this IRS tax code. We'll discuss the decriminalization or the rescheduling or the legalization of cannabis in a few slides as well. But this tax code is very onerous for the industry. There's 2 things that can occur in our industry, and it's either decriminalization of cannabis or the legalization of cannabis. They're not the same thing. Jason, can you expand a little bit on the differences?
Sure. And so, well, the decriminalization is basically, as it says right there, it's a removal of penalties. What that does is a local, either a state or it could be a local jurisdiction will say, you know, marijuana is illegal, but we're going to remove any criminal penalties. So no imprisonment, just a fine, or we're simply going to remove penalties altogether, or we're going to leave the laws as they are, but we're going to tell the police this is the lowest priority for law enforcement. What that does is that generally allows personal use, sometimes cultivation of small amounts. Some places will allow transfer, but not commercial sale. So you remove the penalties, you allow people to use it themselves, but you're not allowing for the creation of any sort of industry. Whereas legalization is as it says, you not only remove the penalties, you make it legal, but you set up a regulatory scheme for an industry. Generally, as we're going to talk about later, that involves regulatory schemes, tax liability, things of that nature. But you basically kind of are taking this thing from being fully illegal and bringing it into the commercial space like any other kind of regulated product. Importantly, as we have right there, is the fact that this governments are starting to become more and more favorable to that because they've seen that the potential for revenue, and so when they legalize versus decriminalize, that allows them to tap into this new revenue source.
So a brief slide on the history of cannabis. In 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, which made marijuana illegal. Well, essentially 3,000 years before that, marijuana was legal and everybody had a plant and they used it. And then in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was passed by the Nixon administration, which put cannabis on the Schedule 1 Act. Essentially, that made cannabis onerous. It made it so that you could not have any possession of it. You couldn't sell it or make any profits from it, so it became an underground industry. And then in 1996, California in the United States legalized medicinal marijuana for the first time, and that's essentially when Cannabis 1.0 started. You had a state that went against federal rulings and said, hey, look, we think there's some kind of medicinal benefits, and we want to be able to grow it, we want to be able to sell it, and we want to be able to profit from it. Well, from 96 to 2020, this rolling wave of legalization by the states in the United States occurred. Now, 36 states have legalized medicinal marijuana, 16 states have legalized recreational marijuana, and at the same time now you have 46 countries that have legalized marijuana. Cannabis 2.0 essentially is starting, which is legalization in countries and in states in the United States. So with global legalization in progress, there has been research that started recently that shows there's medical benefits to cannabis, whether it's THC or CBDs. The US FDA 2 years ago, which is the Food and Drug Administration, which regulates the controlled substances that are sold as pharmaceuticals or drugs, they approved a drug called Epidiolex, which is a medical treatment for seizures. It is actually produced by a British company called GW Pharma that lists in London and the United States, but it has been approved by the US FDA, which is shocking because it contains THC and it is a federally illegal substance. Tax revenues are increasing for governments around the world, states as well. The Canadian tax revenues are increasing. All the states that have legalized marijuana in the United States see their tax revenues increasing. And so we're starting to see the legalization and relaxations of barriers coming down. And we see global growth in progress. So what exactly is the 1970 era U.S. Controlled Substance Act? Jason?
Thanks, Insu. As Insu said earlier, this is passed in 1970 by President Richard Nixon, that basically rolled up all the previous drug laws on the books in the United States and created a new regulatory regime with a set of schedules. And so each the schedules go from Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive, to Schedule 5, which is the least restrictive. And they're placed on these schedules in terms of, what's their potential for abuse, what kind of medicinal potential there is, how addictive they are, things of that nature. And all but Schedule 1, all but Schedule 1 are in theory allowed in some capacity for medicinal use. Schedule 2 obviously are highly restricted. That's where you see things like OxyContin, morphine, things of that nature. Schedule 1, which is the most restrictive, is allegedly the substances which have no medicinal use whatsoever, and so they're completely outlawed. And of course, as Inston mentioned, President Nixon wanted to make sure that marijuana was put on there. I think it was as much for cultural connotations that that drug had as for any other reason. But so where that leaves us right now is that at the federal level, that's the most restrictive place it can be. And then, as you see on here too, there's the note that Schedule 1 and 2 IRS Tax Code 280E applies. That's a tax measure which Insu will get into more detail, but that makes marijuana businesses much less profitable. And it's the history of that's actually a little bit amusing. There was a cocaine dealer in the United States who had a large operation, and he paid his taxes like any other businessman, and he deducted all of his expenses. And I think Congress and the IRS were sort of unhappy that he was able to do that, and so they passed this law, which we'll get into a little bit later. The way that this works is you have these schedules. There are a couple of different ways that substances can be moved between different schedules or descheduled altogether. First of all, through legislation, the Congress could pass a law that says marijuana is now legal, removes it from the schedule, removes all the other prohibitions, and then we're in new territory. And there are a couple of bills that have been tried to pass in the last few years. I don't think they have a lot of success, chance of success in the short term. The other thing that could happen is that the Department of Justice, which controls the Drug Enforcement Administration in the United States, or the Department of Health and Human Services could through regulation, do some research. They're supposed to do some research, do findings of fact, and then they can decide that based on that a drug that was in Schedule 1 or 2 should be moved to 3 or 4 or 5 or removed altogether. That would remove some of the legal hurdles at the federal level, but not all of them. There's also a possibility for third parties, literally anyone in the United States, can file a petition with the government and say, I think that this drug has been improperly classified. Here's a bunch of information. I would like it to be reclassified to a different schedule. There have been several of those done over the years, but none of them have been successful. There's a lengthy review process. I think the first time it was done, it was in process for over 22 years before it was finally denied. So that's kind of a non-starter as well. So I think the most potential we're going to have for some sort of a change is an action by a new attorney general in the next administration.
So IRS Tax Code 280E is the big hurdle that U.S. cannabis companies face. And exactly what is it and what does it do? Well, as Jason mentioned earlier, if you own a business that's involved in either Schedule 1 or Schedule 2 list, then the IRS Tax Code 280 does not allow for general business deduction. You get to deduct a little bit of COGS, which is cost of goods sold, but it only relates to the inventory that you're dealing with, like seeds and soil and water and nutrients. You cannot deduct general business costs like shipping, rent, overhead, capital expenditures, maintenance, insurance, marketing, utilities, or employees, which general businesses always get to deduct. And this is the reason why cannabis companies in the United States are not profitable, because you got no tax deduction. So let us give you a quick example. If you're a cannabis company in the United States and you make $1 in revenue, you have all these taxes, federal taxes, state taxes, you have your cost of business, you have your G&A, you have capital expenditures, and you have your stamp fee. And by the time you finish and you have no deductions, you typically lose about 3 cents. Now, some companies own their own real estate, so they may make a little bit of money. Or some companies own or have set up 2 companies, so they can write off some of their G&A and their cost of goods sold, so they can make maybe 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 cents. But as general businesses, they're not nearly as profitable as just normal businesses that can deduct all this stuff. So essentially, what happens to cannabis companies in the United States when you make the IRS Tax Code 280 go away? Well, you normalize taxes for the cannabis industry. They become profitable overnight. You'll easily increase operating profits by at least 50%. You'll allow access to banking and capital. You'll allow money to flow into these businesses because they're all of a sudden profitable. And then you develop a roadmap for growth and legalization for the industry. And the question is, will this happen, or how can it happen? Well, we think there is a roadmap being developed right now. As you all know, well, it's not 100%, but we're moving toward it every day. We have a new administration that will take, will step into the White House on January 20th of 2021. It's Biden and Harris administration. And they support federal decriminalization of the cannabis. Kamala Harris, who's the vice president, has been a very, very large proponent during her entire career to decriminalize cannabis. And in the past year, in 2019, she sponsored the MORE Act, which was essentially to take cannabis off the Controlled Substances Act. The Republican Party blocked this legalization, but now that she is vice president and part of the new administration, the Republican Party cannot block the rescheduling of this substance. And if they can reschedule the substance from Schedule 1 down to 3, 4, or 5, IRS Tax Code 280 will not apply to cannabis. So we think that that is a catalyst for 2.0. Biden and Harris will nominate a new attorney general, and this attorney general can unilaterally initiate the process to reschedule cannabis. And if, like we said earlier, if we can move it from Schedule 1 to 3, 4, or 5, then IRS Tax Code 280E does not apply. Then overnight, all these companies that are listed in Canada but have operation in the United States will have tax deductions, and they become profitable overnight. And the question you have to ask is, will rescheduling or legalization receive support in the United States? Well, just 2 years ago, the Gallup poll took a poll to see what the support for legalization, full legalization of marijuana was in the United States. And in 2018, it was at 66%. And as of 2020, it's approaching 70 and going higher. Well, why do you want to legalize marijuana or decriminalize it? It creates jobs. Job industry in this business is one of the fastest growing industries for job growth. All you have to do is see the country across the United States, the large cities that have legalized marijuana, or states that have legalized it, and the jobs that are created in those cities. All you have to see is the population movement into Denver or to Oregon or to Seattle just to see the amount of job growth there are in those cities and those states. Along with that job growth, there's obviously sales. The current year estimate for 2020 is over $20 billion in sales, total sales. The orange bar is, excuse me, is recreational, and the blue portion of it is medicinal. So essentially, you're going to see for the next 5 years compounded growth rate of about 25% or more, depending on which states that you're located in. And along with that, you get to charge excise taxes along with sales taxes. The average excise tax in the states that have legalized marijuana is 18.3%. And in Alaska, they charge $50 per ounce, which turns out to be $800 a pound. Now, $800 a pound in the state of Colorado is essentially the price of a wholesale pound of cannabis. So they're taking a big slug of the revenue. Per capita excise tax by month is between $3 and $4.50. So this equates to somewhere between $35 to $50 a year, per person in that state. Now, that's every single person in that state, not necessarily just the user. So it's a tremendous amount of revenue for the state. And it's reoccurring revenue for every single person. Excise tax growth as of November of 2018 was 35% year over year. Cannabis at that time was almost equivalent to all alcohol sales. It's long since passed all the excise taxes that have that's being generated by the alcohol industry, and in the next 3 to 5 years, it will equal tobacco. So it is a huge amount of revenues for the states that legalize. Sorry about that. So I'll give you an example of how one state in the United States collects their taxes. They collect 15% at the wholesale level. They collect 15% at the retail level. And they also collect 2.9% as general sales tax. So 1/3 of all sales is collected in terms of revenue for the state. And that's not including the federal government tax that's added on top of this. All at the same time, the cost at the wholesale level is decreasing. So in January of 2014, a wholesale pound of cannabis in the state of Colorado was around $1,900. As of January 1st of 2019, it was approaching $800, and it's fairly stable at this point, up and down about $100 from there. And as of 2019, all taxes collected in the states that are legalized is pushing about $2 billion. This year in 2020, it will be closer to $2.5 billion, according to ITEP. Global sales, all global sales of marijuana, this is a large estimate. They believe that the current market for marijuana, legal and illegal, is closer to $350 billion. Now, that's a large estimate, and obviously the numbers can fluctuate, but that's a pretty large market size. So how does all this affect Canada? What does Cannabis 2.0 mean for Canada? Well, Canada was very smart and early to the game, and they have given a legislative framework for global cannabis companies. It allows value growth in this industry to flow through Canada. We'll give you a case study of a company that is a Canadian listed company that has majority of its operations currently in the United States. It is called TerrAscend. It's a Canadian holding company that has operations in Canada, US, and in Europe. But 80% of its revenues, and it's sometimes as high as 90% of the revenues, is in the United States. and up to 20% of the revenues is in Canada, and Europe is just starting. But the holding company is in Canada. The US operations provides all of the profit. The Canadian operations currently is break even. They just went break even in the third quarter. If you did not have 280E in the United States, the profitability for the US and the free cash flow would increase even faster. And your Canadian holding company, the values would increase even faster. So essentially, this next slide shows the holding company structures and why these Canadian companies and why Canada will benefit over the next 10 years. Your federal legalization gives legal coverage to all the companies that are created in Canada. And that holding company also is the owner of a holding company that trades as an ADR in the United States. And that holding company in the United States, because it's just an ADR, operates all the US operations. Now, there's more than money that transfers back to Canada. There's a technology transfer that occurs. There's know-how that transfers. All the while, the Canadian holdco, the holding company, provides legal coverage and also implements the operational knowledge that they've gained from US operations into the Canadian operator. And at the same time, they have the same type of legal framework with Europe. So essentially, the Canadian companies have taken advantage of legislative arbitrage to create legal structures to operate in cross borders. Why is that important? Well, currently, the total U.S. revenues for all cannabis sold that's legal in the United States is about $20 billion. If you grow this business for the next 10 years at 15% a year in the U.S., it'll reach $81 billion. If you grow it at 20%, it'll grow to $125 billion. If you grow it at 25%, you grow it at $186 billion. And then if you grow it at 35%, it'll be a $400 billion industry. Globally, which is about a $30 billion industry right now, you see the numbers if you grow these revenues over the next 10 years. You're going to collect, or these governments are going to collect billions of dollars a year in excise tax. If it's 18 to 20%, you can just easily do the math and realize that if you compounded your growth for the next 10 years at 25%, globally, these countries are going to collect close to $55–60 billion in taxes. And at the same time, the market valuations of these companies that are in business that survive and continue to grow will increase tenfold or more. Some of the Canadian companies that we see that are global brands or companies that have majority of their operational companies in the United States are listed here. As you can see, the companies that are denoted by the asterisk are companies that are approaching positive cash flow at the EBITDA level. And if you look at the stocks themselves and the prices they're trading and the valuations, you'll start to understand that as companies approach positive cash flow, their values increase tremendously. So today, the market capitalization for all these Canadian cannabis companies combined on any given day or week is between $25 to $30 billion. Where can they be in 10 years? If you have an industry growing between 15 and 25% a year, which cannabis is growing closer to 25% or higher, you're going to end up with market capitalization between 300 and 400 billion dollars fairly easily. Money will flow to higher growth business, and it's legalized in Canada. And you have more than just smokable flower. And all this technology is being developed and moved to Canada as we speak, and it's being moved to Europe. So these companies that are holdcos in Canada will benefit. We will talk about hemp and CBDs on another day, and we'll open up to questions currently. And this is the end of our slide presentation. If you have any questions.
Great, thanks very much, Insoo and Jason. There are a number of questions that have flown in. So one of them is, this is a very dynamic industry. Fast-paced mergers and acquisitions, new companies launching, old companies re-emerging. How's this going to affect investors in this space? Insoo, you want to start?
Sure. David, money flows, big capital flows to companies that are profitable. And if you look back a few slides, we'll get to it here in just a second. All the companies that have the asterisks next to it, you'll see that they're performing incredibly well because they're getting close to profitable, or they are profitable at the cash flow level. And money will flow to them. So as the industry grows, more money will flow to companies that are profitable, and they will be the winners in the industry. They'll eat the other ones that are not profitable. These companies are specializing in a very narrow segment of the business. They're focusing as, very effective, efficient companies. And the other companies, they haven't really found their way yet. Hopefully they will.
And what will the distribution channels be? Will they be the same across the states or different? Insoo first, then Jason, if you could.
Well, in the United States, it's a bit complicated because it's not federally legal, so you can't transmit this illegal substance across state lines. It's illegal. So it will have to be set up as state by state distribution. And not only will it be state by state, each state has their own regulations. Some states might allow only certain products, and other states will allow a multitude of products. For example, New York does not allow edible products yet. It's only smokable vapes. And they do not allow sale of just straight flower. Whereas you can drive to Connecticut, which is 20 minutes away, and you can sell all range of products. So the distribution channel will be limited in the United States to state by state, and interstate commerce will not be allowed until it's federally legalized. Jason?
Yeah, and you are seeing everything Insoo said. I agree with. I would add on that you are seeing along, I would say, a plurality of the states where it's legal. There's convergence in the regulatory regimes. They're starting to kind of take best practices from each other. At least the states that legalized later are kind of looking back at the ones that legalized earlier and trying to imitate what worked and not imitate what didn't, although not 100%. So you're as long as we have this sort of strange, federally illegal but legal in the states system, you're never going to have uniformity. You're always going to have just a slightly different regulatory regime in each market you're in. And the distribution channels, majority of them are going with sort of a licensed, usually limited licensing. They'll have, you know, X number of licenses that they give out to people, and you have to apply and meet certain criteria. But I think there are a couple of states where it's state run, and there may be still some states where they have unlimited licensing. So it's still a little bit up in the air.
And Jason,
I'll add a little.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, David.
I had a quick question for Jason. Is the sales tax buried in the price, or is it added on as a value-added tax paid by the consumer?
Well, the sales tax, at least here in Colorado, it's like any other sales tax. I mean, these companies all get the same kind of tax license that you know, a T-shirt store or something like that would get. See what the tax is. Of course, the excise tax is more like a value-added tax in that it's taken at the transfer at the wholesale level, and the consumer doesn't necessarily see what that is. They just see a price.
Okay, and so another question that's come in is the presentation really covers the upside of what happens when all goes well in the U.S. With the upside potential. What happens if Biden administration does not reschedule?
Well, I think I think worst case scenario is just sort of a continuation of the status quo. I mean, what we saw, you know, the Obama administration, they published a memorandum from the Department of Justice that basically said we're going to lower the priority of enforcement as long as these companies are meeting certain standards and meeting complying with the laws of their states. They're not going to be targets for enforcement. And then the Trump administration came in. Their first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was actively hostile to marijuana. He was very much an opponent of marijuana. He rescinded that memorandum, and yet, for all intents and purposes, the industry continued on as it had before. So I think, you know, we've seen signals from President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris that they are favorable to some sort of, you know, decriminalization, rescheduling, something like that. But even if they aren't able to do any of those things, I think at the very worst, we're just going to see, you know, the industry kind of continuing as it has over the last several years.
And now, sorry, go ahead.
I'd like to add a couple statements to that. There obviously is an opportunity, or there is a chance that there's nothing to happen, you know, from where the regulation is today with the new administration. We've had this conversation with Jason and I and some of the others that know the industry. We don't see anything happening in the first 90 days or 100 days. But as time goes on, let's say within the first year or two, Kamala Harris and Biden, they wanted to decriminalize marijuana. Now, there's very different steps to take, but we think that at the least, there'll be some sort of rescheduling. They do not need the Senate approval, even if the Democrats do not take majority control of the Senate, to reschedule the substance. You've never had an administration up to now that has been such a proponent of decriminalization or legalization. Legalization is going to take a lot more effort. But as long as you get cannabis off of Schedule 1 and 2, then it really changes their growth trajectory, short and long term. It makes them much more profitable in the United States. And the industry is starting to get traction. You got a $20 billion industry that's starting to now focus on lobbying. Take profits from that, and there are a handful of companies that are profitable, and they are pushing a lot of lobbyists to DC now. Now, when you get to a $50-60 billion industry, it's going to double the amount that they're going to spend on lobbyists. The States Act, which was passed last year, was passed by Cory Gardner and Elizabeth Warren. Cory Gardner is a Republican senator, and Elizabeth Warren is a Democratic senator. That was a bipartisan effort to keep the federal government out of cannabis legislation and cannabis legalities in the states. There's a much more favorable climate for the cannabis industry going forward with this administration, at least for the next 4 years. And once you reschedule it, and once these guys start making even more money, the lobbyists they're like ants. They're gonna end up in DC, and there is a pathway to legalization.
Okay, thanks. I just pictured the ants there. So one question, Amazon has recently gotten into pharmaceuticals. So I have to ask, will large players like Amazon be getting into the market? And would this mark a significant shift in direct-to-consumer in cannabis? Jason, you go first.
Thanks, David. I certainly think it's possible, but until we get full federal legalization in the United States, Amazon is never going to be able to sort of operate with the kind of economies of scale that they have in literally everything else they touch. So there's that hurdle. I think even if you do get legalization, I mean, it's going to take a while, I think, before this becomes something that people are even as the opinion is shifting and all this. I think it's just going to take a while before it becomes as commonplace and as unremarkable as any of the other things that Amazon sort of sells on their platform. And I think they're also Amazon's not just a United States company. Obviously, they have the same kind of economies of scale worldwide, I'd imagine, and so yeah, I'll just end with there. I think it's we may see that one day, but I'm certainly not holding my breath for being able to have next day Amazon Prime delivery of marijuana in the near future.
Insoo, anything to add?
I concur with Jason. There has been in various states such as Colorado and California and other states where there's businesses that have popped up that have taken the place of Amazon, where you can get cannabis delivered to your, apartment or place of work within, 30 minutes. So as full legalization occurs, definitely Amazon will get into space, but that could be years. As deregulation occurs, these companies are going to be very profitable very quickly. And then their money's going to be spent with lobbyists and various other ways of, getting the legislative changes that's needed. I think we're not too far away. It's not 20 years. Things are speeding up because the industry is starting to make money. And, Canada has a lot to play with that because they, the Canadian federal legalization of cannabis in Canada has given, the legislative cover for all these companies to go public. There's been billions of dollars raised, and I would say that 80% of that money has gone to nothing. But the 20% of the companies or less that have survived are growing leaps and bounds, and those companies are going to grow and get so big over the next 5 to 10 years that it doesn't really, the money that was lost in the beginning won't really matter if you pick the right company. But yeah, Amazon just got into the pharmaceutical space. They're delivering scripts, meaning drugs that you can get through a prescription, and they're going to create havoc in the industry. But because of the way that the laws are written right now in the United States, it's going to be a while before they get into that space.
And other than legislation, do you foresee anything that's going to impede the industry's growth or make it difficult for investors and businesses to operate successfully? Jason, you first.
I guess it's just as we've talked about earlier. As long as we have this onerous tax burden in the United States, it makes it really hard for these companies to be profitable. They're, I'm not a finance person, so I guess I'll kind of let Insoo speak more to that. But
Insoo, over to you. I think we got you on mute.
The trends are already pretty clear. You've got North America and you've got Europe. Asia's kicking on slowly, and then South America is a smaller market. And South America is actually going to be a pretty large market in the long term because it's going to be where a lot of cultivation occurs. But as with any nascent businesses, and we'll talk about that, more in a business term, all the market capitalizations of the public companies in Canada is around $25-30 billion. That's considered a mid-cap company, one company in the United States. That's smaller than the market cap of Coke, Pepsi, Starbucks. It's like, it's not even a company. It's just a mid-cap company. As those companies grow over the next 10 years, they're all going to end up being large cap companies, meaning they're going to be approaching, $50 billion, $100 billion. And currently they're $4 or $5 billion or less. And as that changes, their economies of scale, their specialties, their ability to make money will be in certain areas. For example, Tilray is really focusing on the pharma. They're partnered with Novartis, which is a Swiss pharmaceutical giant. You've got TerraSend that's really focusing on retail. Their model is like that of a pharmacy. And then you've got all the other companies that are focusing on, like Afria is focusing on beverages, Canopy's focusing on beverages with Constellation brands and all the other derivatives. So as the business grows, they're all going to focus on an area where they have their expertise with their partners. And they're not going to focus on farming. They're not going to focus on transport. They're not going to focus on other parts of the industry. They're going to focus on making money, just like a normal industry. And we're at the earlier stages of that. We're in inning number 3, maybe 2.5 or 3, but we're definitely not in inning number 7 or 8. It will be a bumpy ride, but as these companies prove that they can make money, capital will flow to it. And the companies that can't make money, they will go away. They'll get eaten by the companies that can make money. And then once they legalize federally in the United States, we can pretty much guarantee that a lot of these companies in the United States and globally will start acquiring or making bids for these cannabis companies in Canada. And I think that's where the long-term legislation in Canada will impact what happens to these companies. Are they going to stay in Canada in 10 years, or are they going to be listed in the US, or are they going to be listed in Switzerland, or are they going to be listed in London? That's up to the legislators and the lawmakers in Canada. David?
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Jason and Insoo, both of you, for your insights today. I'm going to encourage the listeners to reach out to us reach out to both Insoo and Jason directly. Their emails are up there. Take a look through the Poirier Group, either on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. And please feel free to follow us. We look forward to having you join us again at the next webinar, and really appreciate your time today. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Insoo.